You will never match your sister, Tige. Not in this lifetime, my mother said, her voice smooth, almost pleasant, like she was offering a polite observation instead of drawing a line I was never meant to cross. She didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The room carried it for her. Every glass paused halfway to a sip, every quiet conversation faded just enough for the words to land exactly where she intended. I remember the way the chandelier light reflected off the polished dining table, the way my sister's smile didn't falter for even a second as she sat there in her tailored blazer, one hand resting lightly on her wine glass like she had already won something that had never been a competition for her. It wasn't the first time my mother had compared us. It was just the first time she decided to make it official, in front of everyone who mattered to her. Look at your sister, she continued, gesturing with a subtle tilt of her glass, the kind that looked elegant if you didn't listen too closely. She built her career, her reputation, everything. She didn't wait around hoping someone would hand it to her. A few people at the table nodded, not aggressively, just enough to align themselves with what sounded like truth. That's how it always worked in my family. No one ever needed to say anything cruel outright. They just had to agree at the right moments. My father didn't interrupt. He never did when it came to these conversations. He simply adjusted his cufflink and looked down at his plate, as if neutrality made him fair. My sister let out a small laugh, soft enough to sound modest, practiced enough to feel rehearsed. "Mom," she said, as if she were trying to tone it down, but she didn't correct her either. She never corrected her. I sat there, hands folded lightly in front of me, posture straight, the way I had learned to carry myself in rooms where respect was not given freely. I could feel the expectation building, the silent pressure for me to respond, to defend myself, to either accept the role they had written for me or embarrass myself trying to fight it. That was always the choice they left me with. I didn't take it. Instead, I allowed a small, polite smile to settle on my face, the kind that didn't challenge anyone, didn't escalate anything. "I understand, Mom," I said, my voice even, measured, respectful in a way that made it impossible to accuse me of disrespect. That answer confused them more than any argument would have. You could feel it shift the air slightly. My aunt glanced at me, then at my mother, like she was trying to decide if something had gone off script. My cousin lowered his phone just a little, no longer pretending he wasn't listening. My sister's smile tightened at the edges, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. Because she knew me. She knew I wasn't someone who surrendered easily. I just didn't do it loudly. The truth was, I had spent years in that exact position, quietly present, carefully underestimated, treated like a comparison point instead of a person. They called me the calm one, the private one, as if those were gentle descriptions instead of convenient labels that made it easier to overlook me. And for a long time, I let them. Not because I believed what they said, but because I understood something they didn't realize I had figured out. In a room where everyone is so certain they know your value, silence becomes a kind of leverage. You learn more by listening than you ever do by arguing. You see more. You remember more. And eventually, you recognize exactly which moment matters enough to speak. I didn't say anything else after that. Not while my mother continued to praise my sister's independence, not while the conversation slowly restarted around me like nothing significant had just happened, not while someone at the far end of the table made a light joke to ease the tension that only a few of us could still feel. I let it all play out. I let them settle back into comfort. Because that's what they needed, comfort, certainty, the illusion that everything in that room was exactly as they believed it to be. And I wasn't going to take that away from them too early. Not yet. Because the truth is, when my mother said I would never match my sister, she thought she was defining my place in that family. What she didn't realize was that she had just chosen the exact moment I had been waiting for. And this time I wasn't going to stay quiet. I remember exactly how the room tried to recover after that moment, like nothing had shifted, like my mother had not just drawn a permanent line between me and my sister in front of everyone who mattered to her. Plates were passed again, someone refilled glasses, and my aunt leaned into a conversation about real estate markets as if that was always the topic of the evening. That was the thing about my family, they had a way of smoothing over discomfort without ever addressing what caused it. My sister adjusted her bracelet and began talking about a new client she had just secured, her voice calm, confident, practiced in a way that made people listen. "It is a large account," she said, not boasting, just stating it like a fact that deserved recognition. They reached out directly. They wanted someone who could handle complexity without needing guidance. There was a quiet ripple of approval around the table. My mother smiled at her, the kind of smile that carried pride without restraint. "That does not surprise me at all," she said. "You have always known how to take control of your own path." I noticed the way she said always, as if history had been carefully edited to support that narrative. No one mentioned the early years when I was the one reviewing contracts late at night with her, explaining terms, helping her understand the structures she now claimed as second nature. No one mentioned the weekends I had spent helping her prepare presentations while she learned how to speak with that same polished confidence she used now. Those details did not fit the version of the story they preferred. And in my family, the version that felt better was always the one that stayed. My father finally spoke, his tone measured, deliberate, the way he spoke when he wanted to reinforce something without making it sound like pressure. "Consistency matters," he said, glancing briefly in my direction before returning his focus to my sister. "Some people understand that early. Others take longer to figure it out." It was subtle, almost polite, but it landed exactly where it was meant to. I kept my expression steady, my posture unchanged, but I could feel the weight of those words settling into the room, reinforcing what had already been said without repeating it. Across the table, my cousin gave me a quick look, not unkind, just curious, like he was trying to understand why I was not reacting the way most people would. That was the expectation, after all. A defense, a correction, some visible sign that I disagreed. Instead, I reached for my glass and took a slow sip, giving them nothing to push against. That was when my sister turned to me directly for the first time since my mother spoke. "You have been quiet tonight," she said, her tone light, almost friendly, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded like she was testing the ground. "How has work been for you?" It was a simple question, but in that room, it carried layers. It was not curiosity. It was positioning. I met her gaze calmly. "Steady," I replied. "I prefer to focus on long-term structure rather than short-term visibility." My answer was measured, respectful, and intentionally vague. It did not invite comparison, and it did not give her anything she could easily reframe. She smiled again, but this time it felt thinner. "That sounds careful," she said. "There is nothing wrong with that," my mother added quickly, as if she needed to soften the implication while still maintaining it. "Not everyone is meant to take risks at that level." A few people nodded again, and I could feel the pattern repeating itself, layer by layer, each comment reinforcing the same idea without anyone needing to say it directly. I set my glass down gently and folded my hands again, letting the silence stretch just a little longer than was comfortable. Not long enough to seem intentional, just enough to be noticed. Because by then, I understood something clearly. This was not a conversation. It was a structure. Every word, every glance, every carefully placed compliment and subtle comparison was part of something they had built over time. A version of reality where my sister stood at the center, and I existed somewhere just outside of it, close enough to be included, but never close enough to matter. In the same way. And the more they spoke, the more confident they became in that version. That was the part they never questioned. They believed it because it had never been challenged in a way they could not ignore. I let my eyes move across the table slowly, taking in each face, each expression, each quiet agreement that passed between them. Then I looked back at my mother, who was already moving on to the next topic, as if the conversation about me had already been resolved. That was when it settled for me completely. They were not waiting for me to prove anything. They had already decided who I was. And the only reason it had worked for so long was because I had allowed them to believe they understood the full picture. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my expression still calm, my tone still composed, and for the first time that evening, I felt no pressure to respond, no need to correct anything. Because I knew something they did not. And I knew exactly when I was going to say it. The conversation shifted again, but the energy in the room did not fully recover, not for me. It never really did once I started seeing the pattern clearly. My sister continued speaking, detailing her recent success with precise language, the kind that sounded effortless but had clearly been refined over time. They needed someone who could restructure the entire portfolio, she said, her tone composed. It required a level of discretion and control that not everyone is comfortable handling. My mother nodded immediately, her expression filled with approval. That is exactly what sets you apart, she replied. You do not hesitate. You step in and take ownership. Ownership. That word stayed with me longer than the rest. It echoed quietly in the back of my mind, not because of what she meant, but because of what she did not understand. Across the table, my father leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together in a way that signaled he was about to reinforce something important. Confidence is not something you can teach, he said. It shows early. Some people are simply wired to lead, and others, he paused, just briefly, as if choosing his words carefully, but the direction was already clear. Others are more comfortable staying behind the scenes. There it was again. Not loud, not aggressive, just precise enough to place me exactly where they believed I belonged. I could feel a few glances shift toward me, quick and subtle, like people checking whether I would finally respond. But I did not. Not yet. Instead, I let my attention settle on the small details, the ones that most people overlooked. The way my sister's fingers tightened slightly around her glass when my father spoke, almost imperceptible, but there. The way she glanced at my mother for just a fraction of a second, not for approval, but for reassurance. It was a habit she had never quite outgrown. And that was when something aligned for me in a way it never had before. They saw her as self-made. Independent. Untouchable. But I saw the structure underneath. I always had. I just had never needed to say it out loud. You have always had a natural instinct for this, my mother continued, her voice softening in that particular way she reserved for praise. Even when you were younger, you knew how to position yourself correctly. Position. Another word that sounded harmless on the surface but carried more meaning than they realized. Because positioning only matters when there is something to stand on. And in my family, no one ever questioned where that foundation came from. My sister smiled again, but this time it did not fully reach her eyes. I have learned from the right people, she said, her tone careful, almost measured, as if she was trying to balance confidence with modesty. My mother reached across the table and touched her hand lightly. You learned because you were willing to, she said. That is the difference. I watched that moment closely, the gesture, the exchange, the quiet reinforcement of everything they believed about her. And for the first time, I did not feel the usual frustration that used to come with it. I did not feel the need to correct them or to defend myself. What I felt instead was clarity. Because I understood something they did not. Their entire perception depended on incomplete information. And the more they spoke, the more certain they became in something that was never fully true. That was the part that made all the difference. Certainty without full awareness is fragile. It only holds as long as no one challenges it directly. I adjusted slightly in my seat, not enough to draw attention, just enough to shift my posture into something more deliberate. My cousin noticed. I could see it in the way his expression changed, just slightly, like he sensed something was about to happen even if he could not explain why. My sister continued speaking, but her tone had shifted again, just a fraction. There was a slight edge of urgency now, subtle but present, like she was trying to maintain control of the narrative before it slipped. At the end of the day, she said, setting her glass down carefully, results speak for themselves. That line was meant to close the conversation. To seal it. To reinforce everything that had already been said without inviting further discussion. And for a moment, it worked. The room settled again, people nodding, murmuring agreement, ready to move on. I let that moment sit. I let them believe it was finished. Because timing matters more than truth in rooms like that. And then, without raising my voice, without changing my expression, I finally spoke. "You are right," I said calmly, my tone even, respectful, impossible to dismiss as emotional. "Results do speak for themselves." The table went quiet again, not dramatically, just enough to notice. My mother looked at me, her expression polite but slightly puzzled, as if she was trying to understand why I had chosen that moment to agree. My sister held my gaze this time, not smiling. Not relaxed. Just watching. Waiting. And for the first time that evening, they were not entirely certain what I was going to say next. No one spoke right away after I said it, and that silence was different from the ones before. It was not polite, not comfortable, not something people could casually talk over. It lingered just long enough to force attention in my direction without me needing to ask for it. My mother set her glass down slowly, her expression still composed, but there was a faint tension around her eyes now, something that had not been there earlier. "Of course they do," she replied, her tone steady, as if she intended to keep control of the conversation. "That is exactly what we have been discussing." She expected me to stop there. To agree and return to my role in the background. I did not. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging her response with the same level of respect I had maintained all evening. "I agree," I said again, calmly. "But I think it is important that we are all measuring the same results." That shifted something. It was subtle, but it was enough. My father's gaze lifted fully to me this time, no longer avoiding, no longer neutral. My sister did not move, but her posture changed, just slightly, like she was bracing without making it obvious. Around the table, conversations that had tried to restart faded again, replaced by quiet attention. "What do you mean by that?" my father asked, his tone controlled, but firmer now, as if he wanted clarity before things moved further. I met his gaze without hesitation. "I mean," I said evenly, "that results depend on what is actually being measured, not just what is being presented." My sister's fingers tightened again around the stem of her glass, just for a moment, and then relaxed. She smiled, but it did not carry the same ease it had earlier. "That sounds like a very careful way of saying something simple," she said, her voice light, but there was a sharper edge underneath now. "If you have a point, you can say it directly." It was an invitation, but also a challenge. And it was the first time that evening she had stepped into the conversation without the safety of my mother speaking first. I kept my tone steady. "I intend to," I replied. "I simply believe clarity matters." My mother exhaled softly, not quite a sigh, but close enough to signal impatience. "Tige," she said, her voice still controlled but less warm than before, "there is no need to complicate things. Your sister has achieved something very real. That is not open for interpretation." I nodded once, acknowledging her statement. "I am not questioning that," I said. "I am only suggesting that the full context might not be as visible as it appears." That was when the shift became undeniable. My cousin leaned forward slightly, no longer pretending to be uninvolved. My aunt stopped mid-motion with her fork, her attention fixed entirely on the exchange. Even the faint background noise from the kitchen seemed to fade as the focus tightened around the table. My father's voice came again, lower this time. "Context of what?" he asked. There was no impatience in his tone, just a deliberate attempt to understand exactly where this was going. I let a brief pause settle before answering, not long enough to feel theatrical, just enough to make the next words land cleanly. "Context of how those results were built," I said. My sister let out a soft laugh, but it did not sound amused. "Are you implying something?" she asked, her eyes fixed on mine now, no longer glancing away. I held her gaze without raising my voice, without changing my expression. "I am not implying anything," I said calmly. "I am stating that outcomes do not exist in isolation. They are supported by structures, decisions, and sometimes, contributions that are not always visible from the outside. My mother's expression tightened slightly. That sounds unnecessarily abstract, she said. We are talking about clear achievements, not theories. I inclined my head again, still respectful. Then perhaps it would be helpful to make it less abstract, I replied. That was the moment everything paused again, but this time there was no attempt to move past it. No one reached for their glass, no one returned to their plate. The entire table was waiting now, not out of politeness, but because something had shifted too far to ignore. My sister did not smile this time. My father did not look away. And my mother, for the first time that evening, was no longer entirely certain how the next moment would unfold. I rested my hands lightly against the table, my posture unchanged, my voice still calm, and I realized something with complete clarity. They had spent years defining me in that room. But they had never prepared for the possibility that I might redefine the entire conversation instead. I let the silence hold just a moment longer, not to create tension for its own sake, but because timing was the only thing in that room I fully controlled. No one interrupted. No one tried to redirect the conversation. That alone told me everything had already shifted further than they expected. I looked at my mother first, then my father, and finally at my sister, making sure each of them understood that what I was about to say was not directed at one person. It was for all of them. You are absolutely right, I said calmly. Clear achievements matter. They should be recognized. My mother nodded slightly, as if she thought I was finally aligning with the conversation again, returning to something familiar. That was exactly what she needed to believe in that moment. Then I am glad we agree, she replied. Her tone softened just enough to suggest closure. But I did not stop. I also believe, I continued, my voice steady, measured, that recognition should include the full structure behind those achievements, not just the visible outcome. My father's expression sharpened slightly, not hostile, just attentive in a way that meant he was now fully engaged. You have mentioned structure more than once, he said. Be specific. It was not a challenge. It was a request for clarity. And I gave it to him. Of course, I said, inclining my head slightly. When we talk about success in this family, we often focus on who stands at the front of it. But we do not always acknowledge what supports that position. My sister let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but there was tension behind it now. You are making this sound unnecessarily complicated, she said. It is not complicated. It is simply results. I turned to her, meeting her gaze without any shift in tone. Results rarely exist without foundation, I replied. That foundation can take many forms. Time, access, preparation, and sometimes, direct support. The last two words landed more heavily than the rest, even though I did not raise my voice. My mother's posture changed, just slightly, like she was becoming aware of something she could not yet define. Support, she repeated. Your sister has not relied on anyone in that way. There it was. The assumption stated clearly, confidently, without hesitation. I did not correct her immediately. I let that certainty sit in the air, because once something is stated that firmly, it becomes harder to retract later. I understand why it appears that way, I said politely. But appearances are often incomplete. My sister set her glass down this time with more intention than before. Not loudly, not aggressively, but firmly enough to signal that she was no longer comfortable with where this was going. If you have something to say, you should say it directly, she said. Her voice was still controlled, but there was no softness left in it. I nodded once. I intend to, I said. I simply want to make sure we are aligned on what we consider relevant. My father leaned back slightly, his eyes still on me, his expression unreadable but focused. Then say it, he said. No impatience. Just a clear expectation. I let a brief pause settle, not to hesitate, but to make sure the next words would not be interrupted or dismissed. Because once they were said, they would not fit back into the version of reality they had been maintaining. For several years, I began, my tone unchanged. I have been involved in the structural side of certain financial decisions connected to this family. My mother frowned slightly, as if trying to place what I meant without fully understanding it. What does that have to do with this conversation? She asked. I kept my voice even. Everything, I replied. My sister's expression shifted again, this time more noticeably. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. The kind that comes when someone recognizes a direction before it is fully revealed. You are being vague, she said. If you are suggesting that you contributed to something, you should be clear about what that is. That was exactly where she needed the conversation to go. Clear. Defined. Specific. I inclined my head slightly in acknowledgment. Of course, I said. Clarity is important. I let my hands rest lightly against the table, my posture still composed, my tone still respectful, but now there was no room left for misinterpretation. Then let me be clear, I said quietly. And in that moment, before I said anything further, I could see it happen. The certainty in the room began to shift, not fully broken yet, but no longer solid. Because for the first time that evening, they were not entirely confident in what I was about to reveal. I let the words settle without rushing to fill the space that followed, because this was the moment where most people would speak too quickly and lose control of what mattered. I did not intend to do that. I kept my tone calm, steady, respectful, exactly the same as it had been all evening, because volume was never what made something land. Clarity did. Over the past few years, I continued, I have been responsible for structuring several of the financial frameworks connected to our family's assets, including the portfolio that has supported recent expansions. My mother's expression shifted immediately, not into understanding, but into resistance. That is not accurate, she said, her voice still controlled, but firmer now. Your sister has managed her own work. I nodded slightly, acknowledging her statement without challenging it directly. She has presented the outcomes, I said. That is correct. My sister's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in focus. She was listening carefully now, no longer dismissing what I was saying as abstract. Then what exactly are you claiming? She asked. Her tone was precise, careful, like she was choosing each word deliberately to avoid giving anything away. I met her gaze evenly. I am not making a claim, I said. I am clarifying a structure that has existed for some time. My father leaned forward again, his attention fully fixed on me now. Be specific, he said. What structure? I allowed a brief pause, not to hesitate, but to ensure that what I said next would not be interrupted or softened by assumption. The investment strategy that supported your last 3 major client acquisitions, I said calmly, was developed through a private framework that I have been managing. The reaction was immediate, even if no one raised their voice. My mother's hand stilled against the table. My aunt looked between me and my sister as if she was trying to process something that did not align with what she had been told. My cousin leaned back slightly, his expression no longer curious, but intent. And my sister did not move at all. Not at first. That is not how it was explained, my mother said after a moment, her tone sharper now, less controlled. I kept my voice even. It was not explained at all, I replied. That is the difference. My sister let out a quiet breath, then shook her head once, as if dismissing the direction of the conversation before it could fully take shape. You are overcomplicating something straightforward, she said. My clients come to me because of my work, not because of anything behind the scenes. I inclined my head slightly. And the structure supporting that work was provided before those clients ever arrived, I said. That is not a contradiction. It is a sequence. That was when the room changed again. Not just in attention, but in alignment. Because for the first time, what I was saying could not be dismissed as interpretation. It was too specific. Too grounded. My father's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in concentration. Are you saying, he began slowly, that you were involved in the preparation of those deals before they were finalized? I held his gaze. I am saying that the financial models, risk assessments, and long-term positioning strategies were developed in advance, I replied. And they were made available through a structure that I maintain. My mother looked at my sister immediately, her expression shifting from certainty to something more uncertain, something that had not been there earlier. Is that true? She asked. It was the first time that evening she had asked a question instead of making a statement. My sister did not answer right away. That silence said more than anything else could have. She reached for her glass again, but this time her hand paused just before touching it. I have always handled my own clients, she said finally, her voice still controlled, but there was a slight tension beneath it now. I nodded once. And you have presented that work effectively, I said. I am not disputing that. I let that acknowledgement sit for a moment before continuing, because this was not about discrediting her. It was about revealing something they had never considered. But presentation is not the same as origin, I added quietly. That was when everything stopped again. Not just paused, but stopped completely. No one moved. No one spoke. Because that single distinction changed the entire structure of what they believed. My father's gaze remained fixed on me, but now there was something different behind it. Not doubt, not yet, but calculation. My mother's expression had lost its earlier confidence entirely. And my sister, for the first time that evening, was not smiling, not composed, not in control of how she appeared. She was listening. And she was no longer certain that the narrative she had relied on would hold. I kept my posture steady, my tone unchanged, and I understood something clearly in that moment. This was the point where silence had done its work. And what came next would not be something they could return from. I did not rush the next part, because this was not just about saying something new, it was about making sure there was no room left for them to reinterpret it into something comfortable. I kept my voice calm, steady, the same tone I had used from the beginning, because that consistency mattered more than anything dramatic. To make this completely clear, I said, the framework I mentioned is not informal. It is not theoretical. It is documented, registered, and legally structured under my name. That was the moment everything shifted. Not gradually. Not subtly. Completely. My mother's expression changed first, the certainty she had been holding on to dissolving into something closer to confusion. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice no longer composed in the same effortless way as before. My father did not speak, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes intensify, like he was quickly reviewing details he had overlooked. My sister finally moved, not dramatically, but enough to break the stillness she had been holding. That does not make sense, she said, her tone controlled, but there was a sharp edge beneath it now. You are suggesting that something I built is somehow yours? I met her gaze without hesitation. I am stating that the underlying structure supporting those results is mine, I replied. There is a difference between presenting outcomes and owning the system that produces them. No one interrupted that sentence. No one even attempted to. The distinction was too direct to ignore. My aunt set her fork down slowly, her eyes moving between us as if she was trying to follow something that had suddenly become much larger than a family conversation. My cousin leaned forward, no longer hiding his attention at all. My mother looked at my sister again, this time not with pride, but with expectation. Is that true? She asked, her voice quieter now, more uncertain. My sister did not answer immediately. That silence stretched longer than any before it, and for the first time that evening, it was not my silence controlling the room. It was hers. I have always handled my clients independently, she said finally, but the sentence felt narrower now, more defensive than confident. I nodded once, not disagreeing, not interrupting. And the capital allocation models those clients relied on were generated through a system that I created and maintained, I said. That system has been active for over 3 years. My father spoke then, his voice low, precise. You are saying that the financial structure behind those deals is legally yours? I held his gaze. Yes, I said simply. That single word landed heavier than anything I had said before. Because it was no longer explanation. It was confirmation. My mother's posture shifted again, her hand resting against the table as if she needed something solid to hold on to. "Why has this never been mentioned?" she asked. I answered without hesitation. "Because it was never asked," I said calmly. My sister's composure cracked just slightly then, not in a visible way most people would notice, but I saw it. The way her shoulders tensed, the way her eyes sharpened, not in confidence, but in realization. "That does not change the fact that I built my reputation," she said, her tone firmer now, as if she was trying to reclaim ground. I did not challenge her. I did not raise my voice. "Reputation and infrastructure are not the same thing," I replied. "One depends on the other more than people realize." The room fell completely still again. No one moved. No one spoke. Because the implication was no longer hidden. It was fully visible, fully understood. My father leaned back slightly, his expression no longer neutral, no longer observational. It was serious now. "If what you are saying is accurate," he said slowly, "then the control of that structure determines the future of those outcomes." I inclined my head once. "That is correct," I said. And that was it. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I raised my voice. Not because I argued. But because I had finally said the one thing they had never considered. Control had never been where they thought it was. And now, for the first time, they understood that. No one moved after that. It was not the kind of silence that people try to fill. It was the kind that settles in because no one knows how to respond without making things worse. I watched it happen in real time, the shift from certainty to calculation, from confidence to hesitation. My mother was the first to break, but not with the same authority she had earlier. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice tight, controlled, but no longer effortless. "We are discussing family, not legal technicalities." I met her gaze calmly. "They are not separate," I replied. "Not when those technicalities define the foundation of what we are calling success." She did not have an immediate response to that. She looked at my father instead, as if expecting him to restore the structure of the conversation the way he usually did. But he did not. He remained still, his focus fixed on me, his expression no longer neutral, but analytical. He was not dismissing what I said. He was processing it. That alone changed everything. My sister finally spoke again, and this time there was no softness in her tone. "You are trying to reframe something that is very simple," she said. "Clients choose who they trust. They chose me." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the point without conceding anything. "They chose the results presented to them," I said. "And those results were built on a system that I control." The word control landed heavier than anything before it. I saw it in the way her posture shifted again, in the way her composure tightened instead of relaxed. "That does not mean you control my work," she replied quickly, almost too quickly. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. "It means I control the infrastructure your work depends on," I said. "And that distinction matters more than people realize." My aunt let out a quiet breath she had been holding, her eyes moving between us with a kind of cautious disbelief. My cousin leaned back now, no longer leaning in, as if he understood that what he was witnessing had already crossed into something irreversible. My mother tried again, but this time her tone had shifted from confident to corrective. "Tige," she said, more sharply, "you are making this sound like a competition, and it is not." I gave a small, polite shake of my head. "I am not competing with anyone," I said. "I am clarifying what already exists." My father finally spoke again, and when he did, the room focused on him immediately. "If this structure is yours," he said slowly, "then access to it is not automatic." It was not a question. It was a realization. I held his gaze. "That is correct," I said. The weight of that answer settled across the table in a way nothing else had. Because now it was not about perception or interpretation anymore. It was about consequence. My sister's composure shifted again, this time more visibly. "You would not," she began, then stopped, as if she was recalculating what she could say without revealing too much. I did not interrupt her. I did not need to. The hesitation said everything. "This is not about what I would or would not do," I said calmly. "It is about understanding how things are actually structured." My mother's voice dropped lower, more controlled, but now there was something else in it, something closer to concern. "Why bring this up now?" she asked. "Why say this here?" I answered without hesitation. "Because it was necessary," I said. The conversation was built on an incomplete understanding. That was when the emotional shift fully took hold. Not dramatic. Not loud. But undeniable. The room no longer saw me the way it had at the beginning of the evening. I could feel it in the way no one interrupted me now, in the way no one dismissed what I said as abstract or unnecessary. Even my sister, who had held her position so confidently before, was no longer speaking over me or redirecting the conversation. She was reacting. And that was the difference. I rested my hands lightly against the table, my posture still composed, my tone still even, and I allowed the silence to return one more time. But this time it was not empty. It was full of realization, of shifting understanding, of something settling into place that could not be undone. Because for the first time, they were not looking at me as the quiet one in the background. They were looking at me as the person who had been holding something they never thought to question. And they were beginning to understand exactly what that meant. No one tried to continue the dinner after that, at least not in the way it had started. The structure was gone. The rhythm they were used to had been interrupted too completely to recover. My mother adjusted her posture again, but this time it was not to regain control. It was to steady herself. "This does not change what has been accomplished," she said, her voice quieter now, more measured, as if she was choosing each word carefully to preserve something that was already slipping. I looked at her with the same calm respect I had held all evening. "I am not trying to change what has been accomplished," I said. "I am making sure it is understood correctly." She did not respond immediately. For the first time, she did not have a ready answer. My father remained silent, but his expression had shifted into something more serious than I had ever seen across that table. He was not dismissing me. He was reassessing everything. My sister sat still, her composure no longer effortless, her confidence no longer automatic. She looked at me differently now, not as someone beneath her, not as someone to be compared, but as someone she had underestimated. That realization carried its own weight. "So what are you saying?" she asked finally, her voice controlled but tighter than before. "That everything depends on you now?" I shook my head slightly. "No," I said. "I am saying everything already did." That was the moment it settled completely. Not just for them, but for me as well. Because there was nothing left to explain. Nothing left to reveal. The truth was no longer hidden behind silence or assumption. It was clear, and it was understood. My father exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his eyes still on me. "Then the question becomes," he said, his voice steady but deliberate, "what you intend to do with that control." It was the only question that mattered now. And everyone at that table knew it. I let a small pause settle, not to create suspense, but to make sure the answer would not be mistaken for something impulsive. "I intend to continue exactly as I have," I said calmly. "With structure. With clarity. And with boundaries." My mother's expression shifted again, this time into something closer to concern. "Boundaries?" she repeated. I nodded once. "Yes," I said. "Because understanding something is only the first step. Respecting it is what comes next." My sister looked down briefly, then back at me, her voice quieter now, more careful. "And if it is not respected?" she asked. I met her gaze without hesitation. "Then access changes," I replied. I did not need to elaborate. I did not need to raise my voice or make it sound like a threat. The meaning was clear enough on its own. That was the difference between control and noise. One required explanation. The other did not. The room remained still, but it was not the same stillness from before. This one carried weight, consequence, and something that had been missing at the beginning of the evening. Awareness. I slowly pushed my chair back and stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the conversation had reached its natural end. No one stopped me. No one tried to redirect the moment. Because they understood now that there was nothing left to debate. As I stepped away from the table, I could feel their attention follow me, not with judgment, not with dismissal, but with something closer to recognition. And that was all it had ever been about. Not proving anything. Not competing. Not matching someone else's position in a room that had already been decided. It was about understanding where I stood long before anyone else thought to question it. I paused briefly before leaving the room, not to look back, not to confirm anything, but because there was one last thing that needed to be said, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough that it would stay with them long after I was gone. I was never trying to match anyone, I said quietly. I was building something you did not think to look for. And then I left, not with anger, not with hesitation, but with a kind of certainty that did not need their approval anymore, because for the first time, the room had gone silent for the right reason.